For the 1979 revolution enshrined anti-Americanism as a key pillar of Iran's foreign policy. And the young men who shouted death to the Shah and overthrew an unpopular American-backed dictator now have gray in their beards, but their attitudes remain unchanged. Tehran rejects the current status quo and sees America's ultimate goal of overthrowing the revolution. And I don't see any of this as likely to change for the foreseeable future. And since the June 2009 elections, many of the more pragmatic voices in the Iranian government have been marginalized. There are no easy answers for this, either Iran's regional aspirations or its nuclear program. The latter is not something that lends itself, I think, either to a military solution or seemingly a diplomatic solution. As mentioned during the recent presidential debates, there is no more important foreign policy challenge facing the U.S. than Iran. And despite our government's pronouncement of a pivot to the Pacific, I'm convinced that reality will continue to take us back to the Persian Gulf. And the next conflict will not be against China, but against Iran, although Syria may give me a run for my money here. But if you understand Iran's experience in the Iran-Iraq War, the War of the Cities, where Saddam just pummeled Tehran with Scud missiles, it created a massive panic in Tehran that nearly led to a revolt against the government. And that experience hardened Iran. It frankly reinforced their desire for it to have a deterrent capability. And frankly, I think it's a rational decision on their part, even though it clearly works against American interests. And the U.S. has not always been the perfect guy in this. I confess my own American bias. I tend to think we're the good guy, but we're not the perfect guy. 1988, the USS Vincennes warship instigated a shooting match with some Iranian boats in Iranian territorial waters. At the height of this shooting incident, it mistook an Iranian civilian airliner for an Iranian combat aircraft and shot it down, killing 290 people. The current head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy today is a gentleman named Admiral Fadavi. He was commanding the small boats engaged in the fight with the Vincennes and remains convinced that this was a deliberate act of murder by the United States. And the U.S. actions after the fact didn't really dissuade him of that. Legion of Merit was awarded to the skipper of the Vincennes, and frankly, the U.S. Deliberately, I think, obscured some of the truth of the events. Even though, frankly, I'm fairly sympathetic for the skipper of the Vincennes' decision to shoot it down. The incident after the fact, I think, was really poorly done by the United States. And in George H.W. Bush's inaugural address, he reached out to Tehran with a statement that said, "Goodwill begets goodwill." And this resonated with Iran with a new president by the name of Rafsanjani. Rafsanjani, at some considerable expense, works to release the hostages in Lebanon that you may recall there was a number of Western hostages. It took him 3 years to do so. And when he finally gets the last one released, he goes to the intermediary in the United Nations asking for, okay, we upheld our end of the bargain. What's the goodwill on the U.S. side? And for the U.S. government at the time, what looked like a good idea in 1989, maybe not so much going into an election in 1992, and the U.S. raises a new series of grievances against Iran and fundamentally doesn't uphold the bargain, its side of the bargain. And Iran never forgave the U.S. for this. In fact, Richard Haas, who worked on the NSC at the time, a number of years later met the Iranian foreign minister, and when he was introduced to him, the Iranian minister said, "Oh yes, Mr. Goodwill begets goodwill." Iran, after 9/11, had made a series of openings to the United States that frankly seemed quite favorable. And while nobody was under great illusions of holding hands and singing Kumbaya with Iran at the time, there were people, Secretary of State Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who thought there were areas where our two nations overlapped or converged. And they thought we should work with Iran, including there was a proposal to establish a supply route for U.S. forces in Afghanistan through Iran at the time. On the other side, there was deep suspicion of Iran's motives. Peter Rodman, a senior official in the Department of Defense at the time, wrote that any official contact with Iran only gave support to the government and, quote, undermined our efforts to delegitimize the regime. And Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld agreed with this and summed up these views in a memo to Bush in August of 2002, stating the long-term goal should be regime change and not accommodation.
In your book, you discussed Operation Earnest Will. the tanker war in 1978. What impact did that have on Iran's thinking of a future conflict with the U.S. Navy?
That's a great question. I described sort of a military conflict. I spent some time in the book, mentioned Reagan interjects U.S. forces after Iran expands the war in the Gulf. It'll lead to probably one of the most unique naval campaigns the U.S. Navy has ever engaged in. And frankly, it was a pretty courageous act by Ronald Reagan because every senior Navy commander and the Secretary of the Navy strongly opposed the entire operation, believing that it was the wrong war, the wrong time, the wrong place. Why get in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war? None of it's made any sense. Persian Gulf, who cares? It's not the Atlantic or Pacific, which was their focus at the time. And the U.S. does this, but it's a very unorthodox military campaign because Iran doesn't have much capability to challenge the U.S. Navy. So what they rely on is two key things. They rely on mines, and they rely on these Revolutionary Guard speedboats. If you can imagine your bass boat with a rocket launcher on the front, that's essentially what they used. And they tried, and they used this asymmetric tactics. They tried to take on the U.S. sort of indirectly, lay mines and these kind of stuff, things that would provide them plausible deniability. Because sometimes it's hard to predict in the middle of an ocean who laid the mine. And it was pretty successful. Iran laid 91 mines in the course of this against the United States, and about 1 in 10 found a victim. One $1,500 World War I era mine that the Iranians were using nearly sank a $500 million U.S. warship. So pretty good bang for the buck, so to speak. And these small boats, while they couldn't sink a warship, if they swarmed it, they could inflict a lot of damage on it. And you attack by 10 or 15 of these small boats, it really has an impact. Ultimately, it failed from their perspective. The U.S. Really had a lot of imaginative ways to counter these sorts of actions. But when the war ended, Iran takes a hard look. In fact, there's a meeting in Tehran in 1991 where they look at the recent Desert Storm and they look at their last conflict, the U.S., and they come to the conclusion that their strategy had been correct, but really they just didn't have the means to properly implement it. That this combination of these small boats and swarms and mines, and perhaps augmented by missiles launched off, anti-ship missiles off the land, could overwhelm a much more sophisticated American adversary. And so they built a military structure that really is designed to accentuate everything they tried 25 years ago against the United States. Only today they really do have the capability.
Is the nuclear issue real or hyperbole? We heard all about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, and that didn't occur. What's the correct policy to address the nuclear weapon issue, weapons of mass destruction, containment, or strike? Could you comment?
Yeah, it may turn out we got it wrong with Iraq and we got it right in Iran, but unfortunately getting it wrong the first time is going to undermine us. There is quite a lot of evidence that Iran toyed with, especially in the 90s and maybe up to 2003, weapons design. A facility at Parchin, which is one of their big main military bases, there's a lot of suspicion of a triggering device was tested for a nuclear warhead. We found computers and laptops and other information with designs of warheads to go on their ballistic missiles. So it's pretty obvious that they've looked at a weaponization program, at least conceptually. However, there is no evidence, at least that I've seen, that Iran has made the decision, the supreme leader's made the decision to actually go for a nuclear weapon. What I think he wants is the capability of a nuclear weapon. I think frankly, Saddam Hussein had some of these same views. It's kind of nice in a nasty region like the Middle East to have ambiguity about what your capabilities are. And the Israeli nuclear program has been based on that for a number of years. And so I think they like it. They would like the ability, if they wanted to develop it for their interest, to quickly have the breakout capability, which would mean taking essentially up to that threshold. Whether they intend to actually implement it or not, right now I think probably not, but circumstances change. Frankly, there is a problem with I think, American credibility sometimes on this issue. because we did get it so wrong in Iraq, and we're so certain that we had it right.
If Israel does attack Iran, what should the U.S. do, and what do you think the U.S. will do?
Well, I hope we can avoid that is my opening thing. I think a war, something like that, would not be in anyone's interest. So I hope there is a peaceful resolution, at least to the nuclear aspect of it. You know, wars are easier to start than they are to stop, and sometimes you don't know which way they go. And frankly, how Iran would respond to an Israeli strike is frankly an open guess right now. Whether they would, you know, unleash Hezbollah, or whether they would, you know, play victim, who knows? And whether the Israelis will strike is again another issue that I don't think anyone is quite sure of. I think it's a handy tool for the Israelis to continue, because it does keep international pressure on. But I'm also convinced that if they think Iran is going to go for a nuclear weapon, and the U.S. or another country is going to do anything about it, I think they will take military action. And again, then it'll purely depend on Iran's response to it, and whether it drags the U.S. into the conflict or not.
Along those lines, would you talk a little bit about the political power in Iran, given they have a president and they have religious leaders, and where that exactly lies and how that would manifest itself?
Yeah, it is a convoluted government, and it was set up deliberately with a bunch of diffused power bases. Ultimately, the supreme leader is the decider, if you will. Most of the tough decisions, particularly on, say, nuclear issues or major national security issues, all default to the supreme leader. So there's just a tremendous amount of different views within Iran. It's part of the reason that everything seems to default to the supreme leader, because the bureaucracy, or even at a senior level, can't always agree on a course of action. So hence it always has to default to the supreme leader. That used to apparently annoy Ayatollah Khomeini to no end.